The fossils that grew younger. Every day, Celia Hart carried the sealed sample box down into the excavation pit with both hands. Inside the box was a rib she had cut from the buried structure the previous evening. The seal strip still crossed the lid. Her initials on the seal were unbroken. Through the clear upper panel, she could see the pale mineral curve resting exactly where she had placed it. At the bottom of the pit, another rib occupied the empty socket. Celia stopped on the final rung of the ladder. The new piece was not merely similar. It had the same narrow bend near the lower joint, the same shallow groove along its outer face, and the same hairline crack that forked near the tip. Even the surface ridge where her cutting tool had passed through the surrounding frame remained visible below it. The rib she had removed was still sealed in her hands. Yet a second rib had grown in the exact place from which she had taken it. She set the box on a flat stone and checked the pit marker. The coordinate tag matched. She pulled up the image from the previous evening and held it beside the exposed frame. The cut surface in the image and the cut surface in front of her were identical. No one had moved the excavation. She checked the seal again. It had not been opened. Then she pressed a load probe against the replacement rib. The probe clicked into place and reported resistance. Celia increased the pressure a little. The rib flexed less than a millimeter and returned to its original shape. It was solid. It had mass. It carried force. Whatever had happened, the sample had not returned to the ground. A second rib had been built in its place. A sampling technician reached the edge of the pit and looked down at her. Did someone replace it? Not without replacing the ground around it, Celia said. She activated the dating unit and ran the same procedure she had used the night before. The buried frame had returned an estimated age of 3 million years in every previous test. The new result appeared. 2,500,000 years. Celia ran it again. The number shifted within a margin of error, but not enough to matter. The structure had apparently become almost 500,000 years younger since the previous evening. Her wrist terminal began receiving messages from the other excavation pits. The first team reported the same drop, then the second, then every active site across the plain. Thousands of structures had changed age during the same night. Their values were not identical, but each had fallen by nearly the same amount. Celia climbed out of the pit and opened a camera log. The recording showed the empty excavation underwork lights. Nothing entered. Nothing touched the exposed frame. Then the image vanished for less than a second. When it returned, the rib was present. The same blank interval appeared in every camera log across the plain. The loss had occurred at the exact same moment. Electrical fault? The sampling technician asked. Maybe, Celia said, but an electrical fault did not build that rib. Stop all new sampling in this sector. Do not remove anything else. The operations supervisor arrived before Celia had finished placing markers around the socket. The supervisor looked first at the rib in the ground, then at the one inside the seal box. Tell me we have a labeling error. We do not. A scanner error? The age reading could be wrong. The mass is not. Celia knelt beside the socket and pushed a narrow collector into the loose material around it. The collector came back with less loose material than expected. A thin layer of dust covered the frame, although the pit had been cleaned before the sample was taken. She brushed some of the dust into a second container. What are you looking for? The supervisor asked. A source. If matter appeared here, something nearby should be missing. The operations supervisor glanced toward the distant processing towers. How long before this happens again? Celia reviewed the pattern in the age measurements. Each structure had lost nearly 1/6 of its measured age. The active surfaces also showed a similar increase in completion around joints and edges that had previously looked eroded. The projection required no elaborate model. If the same change continues, she said, 5 more pulses will carry the readings to 0. The last should arrive on the 6th morning since I took the sample. 0 means what? I do not know yet. Does 0 mean alive? Celia looked across the plain. Excavation lights stood above hundreds of pale arcs rising from the soil. For months, the settlement had treated them as fossils. Some resembled ribs, some joints, some broken lengths of spine. No complete skeleton had ever been found. It means the instruments will stop reading old material, she said. It may also mean the structures finish whatever they are doing. The supervisor's expression hardened. Then I need options before the next event. You will have evidence before you have options. Celia ordered the teams to weigh the loose mineral around the renewed rib, collect the new dust, and install mechanical markers that required no power. Simple rods would record movement. Locking rings would preserve changes in angle. Powder lines would show whether material shifted across the surface. She kept the old rib sealed. It would remain the fixed point in everything that followed. By midday, the first answer was already forming. The soil around the socket had lost almost the same mass that the new rib had gained. Not exactly the same, but close enough that the difference could be explained by the dust pushed from the frame. The dust was older than the material in the new rib. Celia repeated the measurements with fresh tools and a second team. The pattern remained. The new rib had not appeared from nothing. The structure had taken minerals from the ground, arranged them into a new part, and shed some of its older material as powder. She carried the sealed rib and the dust samples into the field laboratory. The chief grid engineer was already waiting beside the imaging table. The operations supervisor stood near the door with a list of systems that depended on the extraction zone. Celia placed the old rib on one side of the table and the readings from the new rib on the other. There is no reverse time, she said. The supervisor folded both arms. Explained that without using laboratory language. Celia pointed to the sealed box. This piece is still 3 million years old. It did not change. The new piece in the ground was built from nearby minerals. At the same time, the buried structure discarded some of its old material. She poured a small amount of the dust into a clear dish. The dating unit is not watching 3 million years disappear. It is seeing less old stone and more newly formed material. The average becomes younger. The chief grid engineer leaned closer to the dust analysis. So the reading is real, but the meaning is wrong. Yes, the structure is not moving backward through time. It is replacing itself. Replacing itself with what? The supervisor asked. That is the next question. The supervisor brought up a map of the settlement. Several excavation pits lay close to service tunnels. Others stood near buried power lines and mineral conveyors. Until you answer it, we have to reduce the risk. We can lift the nearest structures out before the next change, or cool the ground and slow the reaction. Neither proposal was unreasonable. That made them more dangerous than a foolish order would have been. If the structures are independent, removal might work, Celia said. If they are connected, removing them could change the response somewhere else. Give me one limited test. A small peripheral structure was selected far from occupied buildings. The sampling team removed a thin sliver from its outer edge. They marked the cut, weighed the fragment, sealed it, and placed mineral gauges in a wide circle around the site. Nothing happened immediately. Over the next several hours, however, the ground around the cut began losing mineral content faster than the control sites. The loss did not remain close to the missing sliver. It spread outward in a broad, shallow pattern. The structure was drawing replacement material from a larger area. When the next pulse came, every electronic camera went white for a fraction of a second. The mechanical markers did not. After the image returned, the sliver had grown back. The missing mass had been collected from a region many times wider than the original cut. A faint line of fresh, settling extended toward the nearest service foundation. The operations supervisor stared at the map. If we remove a whole frame, the replacement demand could spread under the tunnels, Celia said. If we remove thousands, we might pull material from every foundation on the plane. The supervisor looked at her. Your preliminary report called these structures inactive mineral fossils. It did. That report allowed excavation to expand. I know. Celia opened the document on her terminal. Her name and approval mark remained at the bottom. She added a formal suspension notice and signed it. Production alarms appeared immediately. Deep excavation stopped at the major pits. Conveyor schedules changed. The settlement began losing output before anyone understood what had been found. Celia did not offer an apology that could not repair anything. My classification was wrong, she said. I'm correcting it now. The supervisor read the suspension and accepted it into the operations system. Then find out whether all of this is one problem or 1,000. We cannot plan around both. Celia looked through the laboratory wall toward the pale arcs under the setting light. The question was no longer what one buried skeleton was doing. The question was what could make thousands of distant structures change together as if the entire plane were performing one action. Before the next pulse, Celia replaced every important electronic observation with something that could survive a moment of blindness. Teams lowered steel rods beside selected frames and set sliding collars at their current heights. Locking rings were fitted around exposed joints so that any change in angle would remain recorded. Fine powder was spread in measured lines across undisturbed soil. None of the devices could explain what happened, but each could preserve the result. The chief grid engineer synchronized clocks by hand with the control room. The cameras remained active, but Celia no longer trusted them to carry the whole investigation. The pulse arrived during the quietest part of the night shift. Every screen flashed white. The mechanical markers clicked. When the cameras recovered, teams moved across the plane with lamps and measuring tools. The rods showed that the first movement had begun below the exposed frames. The locking rings recorded small changes almost everywhere. Some joints had risen. Others had rotated. A few had drawn inward by less than the width of a finger. The changes were not random. At distant pits, structures made from different local minerals had produced the same new crystal pattern. Lines of old dust had also shifted. They formed thin trails that repeated the same directions across widely separated sites. Celia laid those directions over the map. They did not point toward the processing plant or the settlement. They connected excavation zones to one another. Something below us is distributing material, she said. The operations supervisor studied the lines. A root system? Maybe a network. Not necessarily roots. We should describe what it does before we decide what it resembles. They opened a shallow trench between two major pits, choosing ground where no large structure lay. The team removed only the upper layers and stopped whenever the mineral readings changed. Several feet below the surface, they found threads no thicker than wire. They were not cables. They had no insulation, repeating manufacture marks, or central conductor. They were bundles of mineral fibers that divided, rejoined, and disappeared into the surrounding rock. Celia resisted every convenient word that tried to turn them into something familiar. They were not nerves. They were not blood vessels. They were not roots. They were connected structures that carried something between the pits. A team member pressed one fiber bundle with a control mechanical pad. Markers on one side shifted first. Markers on the other side responded a moment later with a different kind of movement. The network transmitted force or redistributed tension, or both. It was enough to prove function. The operations supervisor watched the test from the trench edge. If the whole plane is connected, how far does it extend? Farther than the excavations, Celia said. The pits only show the parts close enough to the surface for us to find. And the age change, still synchronized. Whatever keeps the rhythm is larger than any one site. The supervisor glanced toward the coolant equipment waiting on a transport platform. We still need a way to slow it. Celia understood the request. The settlement could not shut down every time an unknown structure changed below it. A limited cooling test had already been prepared at a remote edge of the field, away from buildings and major lines. The structure in the chilled ground drew minerals more slowly between pulses. For several hours, it appeared to work. Then the pulse came at the expected time, anyway. The cameras blanked. The mechanical markers locked. The cooled module had completed less of its new structure than the others. Its joint face no longer matched the surrounding pieces. Within the next hour, mineral loss around it accelerated as the network tried to compensate. Celia crouched beside the uneven joint and ran a light across it. One edge had formed too late. It had twisted slightly under the pressure of the rest of the network. Cooling did not delay the cycle, she told the supervisor. It delayed one part of the body while the rest kept moving. The supervisor looked sharply at her. You called it a body. Celia had not meant to say the word yet. She looked across the scattered frames. For the first time, she stopped seeing them as rows of separate fossils. Not as a conclusion, she said, as a question we need to test. Back in the field laboratory, the excavation records filled an entire wall. Each pit had been cataloged as an incomplete skeleton. One had a curved structure labeled as a rib cage. Another held a thick joint cluster. A third contained long parallel supports assumed to be legs. None was complete enough for a reliable reconstruction. Celia removed the map labels. Instead of sorting the structures by where they had been found, she sorted them by what kinds of forces they could carry. The curved cluster could not stand on its own. It had no central support and no balance base. The supposed leg cluster had joint faces far too large for the partial body found beside it. Several surfaces listed as breaks were smooth, repeated, and angled in matching ways. Breaks did not repeat with that precision. Locks did. Celia selected two structures found miles apart. She asked the computer to rotate them without changing their scale. The first alignment failed. She changed the angle based on the wear pattern along one edge. The second alignment brought the surfaces closer. Then she adjusted for the new material that had formed after the last pulse. The two faces fit, not approximately. They matched along every ridge. She added a third module. Its joint completed the load path through the first two. A fourth added a flexible band where the combined structure would otherwise have broken under its own weight. The computer did not discover the body. It only obeyed the relationships Celia chose. For hours, she turned parts that humans had named ribs, spines, limbs, and shells. Many of those names were wrong. Some structures that looked like bones were braces. Some that looked like joints were locking surfaces. Some long arcs had no familiar equivalent at all, but their functions joined. The model grew across the wall. One more pulse arrived while the teams were building it. Celia did not repeat the first day by standing over another age display and asking the same question. The event completed a row of locking ridges that matched a distant joint and replaced enough old material to reveal flexible crystal bands beneath what had looked like solid stone. The measured age continued to fall, but the number had become less important than the changing function. The structures were not simply becoming newer. They were becoming capable. Surfaces that had carried no load began to support weight. Incomplete rings closed. Separate modules turned toward positions the full model predicted before the field teams measured them. By then, the approaching zero reading was no longer just a strange value on an instrument. It marked the moment when the scattered structures would have enough new material to do something they had never been able to do while buried apart. The chief grid engineer entered carrying a report on the most recent pulse and stopped in the doorway. That is one organism. One structure, Celia said. I'm not ready to claim organism yet. The engineer walked closer. The model extended over a scale marker representing several miles. You're showing all the excavation sites. They are not separate skeletons. Each pit holds a module. One site carries the central load. Another holds a locking ring. Another has the structures that can lift the combined mass. She highlighted the smooth faces once recorded as fractures. These were never broken. They were waiting for the other pieces. The operations supervisor arrived soon after. Celia did not soften the finding. We have not uncovered a fossil field, she said. We have uncovered a body stored in parts. The supervisor stared at the model. How many bodies? One. Those sites cover half the plane. So does the body. Silence held the laboratory for several seconds. The supervisor finally pointed to the age projection. And zero. Celia brought up the material records. After each pulse, a large fraction of the old mineral framework had been replaced by newly formed crystal. At the same time, more locking faces, flexible bands, and support rings had reached their final shape. Zero is not the return of a mind, she said. It is not a dead creature waking up. The dating equipment is running out of old material to measure. When the reading reaches zero, the new structure will be almost complete. Complete enough to do what? Celia enlarged the newest bands. They were arranged in layered strips along the modules. Under load, they behaved differently from ordinary stone. They tightened slightly when the local magnetic direction shifted. "Move," she said. The word changed the room. Until then, the settlement had faced a process below the ground. Now the model suggested that the process would not remain there. Celia returned to the mechanical records. After each pulse, some modules had turned by a few degrees. Others had straightened. The changes varied from site to site, but when added to the full model, they all served the same result. The parts were aligning for assembly. The chief grid engineer studied the tension maps. These bands react to magnetic direction. They appear to use it as an orientation reference, Celia said. "Can we test that without moving anything dangerous?" The engineer selected a distant branch of the power network and reduced its load for a few minutes. It was not a dramatic shutdown. The branch-fed equipment already placed on standby, and the change remained within safe limits. Mechanical indicators beside 3 modules shifted almost too little to notice. Celia noticed. The tension in the crystal bands moved a fraction toward the western plane. When the engineer restored the load, the bands leaned back toward the settlement. "The field is not controlling them," the engineer said. "They are not following the switch like machines." "No," Celia said. "The direction changed. That is all." The test was repeated at lower power and at another site. The result remained small but consistent. The modules used the surrounding magnetic gradient as a reference. Human power lines had become part of that gradient. Celia plotted the current alignment of the body. Its major load structures were turning toward the inhabited zone. The operations supervisor saw the same thing. "We prepare an evacuation." "Prepare it," Celia said. "But evacuation does not change where the body assembles. If it crosses the settlement, it could cut through the power network, the processing plant, and every buried foundation in its path. Then where was it supposed to go?" That question sent Celia back to the oldest rock, not the newest machinery. The settlement had detailed magnetic maps from the present, but only fragments of the field that had existed before construction. Celia asked the survey team for cores drilled beneath the power lines and outside the developed zone. Minerals in those ancient layers had locked themselves into the direction of the planetary field when they formed. The record was imperfect, but it was older than the settlement and older than the grid. Across the cores, one broad pattern emerged. Before the transmission cables, extraction towers, and processing plant were built, the local magnetic gradient led away from the buried modules. It formed a long corridor toward an empty basin of exposed stone west of the settlement. The body had a natural route. The modern grid bent that route. Celia placed the old and new maps over each other. The point of greatest distortion lay beneath the processing district. From there, the altered gradient passed directly through the inhabited edge. "It is not coming toward us," she said quietly. The operations supervisor looked from a map to the full body model. Celia continued. "We moved its road. The sentence did not remove the danger. It changed who was responsible for creating it." Celia opened her preliminary survey report and added the new findings. The document had once stated that no active biological process existed below the mining zone. That conclusion had allowed the grid to expand across the plane. She attached the mineral balance records, the mechanical marker data, the matching lock surfaces, and the ancient magnetic map. Then she requested a formal review of her original approval. The operations supervisor read the request before speaking. "That review can remove you from the field. After the final pulse, the review should include everyone who signed the expansion. My name is the one on the biological classification. I'm not asking whether you deserve review. I'm asking whether you can finish this investigation if it starts now. Then schedule it after the immediate hazard. Do not cancel it." The supervisor accepted the request. Celia did not feel relieved. The settlement still stood on the wrong side of a path that had existed long before any human arrived. Knowing the original route was not enough. They had to prove it could be restored without making the alignment worse. The chief grid engineer proposed a limited field test. A small service sector near the western edge could be transferred to backup power. One major branch could then be shut down for several minutes. Survey induction rings, already used for mapping underground deposits, could create a weak and steady magnetic corridor toward the ancient basin. Celia approved the locations of the rings based on the body model. None could sit near an unfinished locking face. A misplaced field might pull one module away from the angle required by the others. The operations supervisor approved the test only after the engineer confirmed that no essential system depended on the selected branch. The branch went dark. Across the test area, the mechanical indicators slowly moved toward the western basin. The change was small, but it followed the ancient corridor rather than the settlement grid. The engineer energized the survey rings at low power. The indicators steadied. Their movement became more consistent from one module to the next. "Hold it there," Celia said. The engineer increased power by a modest amount to test the limit. Several indicators began to tremble. One locking ring shifted sideways instead of rotating into line. "Reduce it," Celia said immediately. The power dropped. The trembling stopped. The result established the final rule they needed. A strong field did not provide better control. It introduced a second distortion. The body could not be pulled into place like metal on a chain. The existing source of interference had to be removed first. Then a weak, continuous corridor could restore the old direction. Humans could not command the body. They could only stop giving it the wrong reference. The operations supervisor called a planning session in the control room. No crowd gathered. The people present were there because each controlled a system that would be affected by the decision. The chief grid engineer listed the cost without exaggeration. The extraction lines would stop completely. A mineral batch already inside the processing cycle would likely be ruined if power was cut before the system finished. Several high-load machines might not restart. Medical support, air circulation, communications, and shelter systems would have to be separated onto backup sources. The settlement could survive that way, but only at essential levels. The operations supervisor turned to Celia. "Present the alternatives." Celia placed 3 images on the wall. The first showed the widened mineral draw around the repaired sample. If we dig the modules out, the network replaces what we remove. The demand spreads. At full scale, that could pull material from foundations and tunnels. The second image showed the cooled module and its misaligned face. If we cool the field, the planetary pulse still arrives. Some modules fall behind and then draw more material to catch up. We increase the risk of failed assembly. The third image showed the current grid line bending the old magnetic corridor through the settlement. If we leave the grid unchanged, the body assembles along the path we created. Evacuation may protect people, but it does not protect the settlement or the organism. The two will occupy the same space. The supervisor looked at the western basin. "In your plan, move essential systems to independent power. Shut down the branches that bend the corridor in an order set by the grid team. Place the survey rings along the ancient route and keep them weak. When the final pulse comes, remove the last source only after essential systems are confirmed safe." What do we lose? Production, the current batch, some equipment, possibly more if restart fails. The grid will have to be redesigned before full operations resume. What guarantee do we have? None. We have a tested cause and a tested response. That is not a guarantee. It is evidence. The room remained quiet. The supervisor asked, "Who has authority over the final cut?" "You do," the chief grid engineer said. "I perform it." "And the biological recommendation?" Celia opened the formal hazard statement. "Mine." She signed her name beneath the recommendation to isolate the interfering branches. She also stated that the shutdown would destroy property and interrupt the settlement's primary industry, and that no available plan avoided all loss. The operations supervisor read every line. Then the supervisor approved the plan, conditional on full separation of the essential systems before the final pulse. Work began immediately. The medical rooms transferred to independent power first. Their independent power units were tested under load, disconnected, and tested again. Air circulation followed in sections so that no occupied zone lost support. Communications moved to lower band equipment. Shelter areas were prepared along the inner side of the settlement, away from the predicted assembly corridor. The evacuation plan remained orderly. People at the western edge moved equipment and personal supplies, but there were no sirens and no speeches about survival. The danger was large, but it was understood well enough to manage. Celia spent most of the preparation outside. She walked the planned corridor with the chief grid engineer and marked places where no induction ring could be placed. The full body model showed several modules that needed room to rotate toward one another. A ring too close to those faces could create a local pull that fought the larger route. "This gap looks wrong on the power map," the engineer said at one point. "We will have a weak section here." "It is where two locking structures meet," Celia replied. "A stronger field at that location could turn one before the other is ready. Keep the gap." The engineer adjusted the layout. Survey rings and mining cables were arranged in a broad line toward the western basin. Their power would remain low. They were not a track. They were a repaired reference. By the last evening, most major branches had been shut down. Extraction towers stood dark. Conveyors rested with loads still on them. The settlement's usual industrial vibration faded until Celia could hear wind passing through the marker rods. The mechanical indicators across the plain showed that most modules had begun leaning toward the ancient route. One region had not. The processing district still held a high-load branch. Its protective system could not release the branch until the active mineral batch was isolated from the main equipment. Cutting earlier could damage the grid connection before the essential separation was complete. The chief grid engineer pointed to the branch on the control display. "This remains live until the batch is contained. After that, we can isolate it." "How close to the pulse?" the supervisor asked. "Closer than I would choose." Celia checked the mechanical markers near the corresponding body modules. Their tension still leaned toward the settlement. "Then we treat the deviation as expected," she said. "We do not pretend it is a surprise later." The final pulse was projected to arrive at dawn. Celia returned to the laboratory and collected the sealed sample box. The original rib had not changed. Its mineral record still carried 3 million years. It was not magically linked to the structure beneath the plane. It did not vibrate or glow. It remained what it had always been, old scaffolding removed before its replacement was finished. She carried it to the control room because it held the simplest proof of the entire mystery. One rib was 3 million years old. The other had been built days ago. The dating unit had called the buried structure younger because the old material was being replaced piece by piece until almost nothing ancient remained in the active body. Near midnight, the chief grid engineer confirmed that medical support, air systems, communications, and shelters were running independently. The operations supervisor confirmed that the western edge had been cleared. The survey corridor held steady at low power. The processing branch remained live. Celia placed the sample box beside the main display. When the reading reaches 0, the supervisor said, "What exactly should we expect?" "The number will mean that the active structure contains almost no old scaffolding left for the instrument to measure," Celia said. "The body should have enough completed joints and movement bands to assemble." "Should?" That is the honest word. Outside, the sky began to pale. Across the plain, thousands of buried structures waited beneath a thin cover of dust and stone. The settlement had called them fossils because they looked like remains. Celia now understood that they were not remains. They were preparations. The final change began with the loss of every image. At the first edge of sunrise, the cameras across the excavation field turned white. The control room displays emptied at once. The mechanical monitoring network remained. One indicator moved, then another. Across the map, thousands of simple markers began recording motion that no camera could see. Sliding collars climbed their rods. Locking rings snapped into new angles. Powder lines separated as the ground shifted beneath them. The age display fell through its final range and reached 0. For less than a second, the plane existed only as pressure, angle, and movement. Then the cameras returned. The buried frames were rising. Curved structures lifted from separate pits and rotated toward one another. Rings that had lain at different depths straightened into common planes. Great mineral arcs pulled free of the soil, not with an explosion, but with a slow release of weight that had been waiting beneath the surface. Old material spilled from them as pale dust. There was no flesh beneath it. Nodica. The discarded scaffolding broke apart like dry stone, while the new crystal bands caught the dawn and tightened. Several modules miles apart turned until their smooth faces met. Their ridges entered matching channels. Loads passed from one structure to the next, and the separate pieces became stable only after joining. The central frame rose higher. What humans had called rib cages opened into layered supports. What they had called legs unfolded into broad, load-bearing assemblies. Long arcs that had never resembled any known bone formed flexible spans along the outer body. The full shape was not a copy of any animal Celia knew. It stood on several powerful supports arranged around a low central mass. Above them, interlocking mineral fans held weight and distributed motion through the entire structure. Bands of new crystal ran between the rigid sections, tightening and relaxing with the planetary field. The body was vast, but its assembly was precise. It did not rise from a grave. It completed a birth that had taken millions of years. Western markers are aligned, the chief grid engineer said. Most of the body leaned toward the survey corridor. The weak field held a continuous path to the empty basin. Then the processing markers changed. A chain of indicators near the settlement edge shifted away from the ancient route. On the main display, one section of the forming body began turning toward the still active branch. The deviation matched the earlier test. It was not new. It was the consequence they had prepared for. Processing branch is still carrying load, the engineer said. Status of isolation, the operations supervisor asked. A control team responded. The mineral batch had been contained. Essential systems were separated. The branch could be cut. The engineer added the cost in the same calm voice. The current batch will be lost. 2 drive units may not restart. The line's protective system will probably fail. In the open position, on the external display, the misaligned section continued to rotate. Its unfinished locking face pointed toward the first row of settlement foundations. Celia checked the mechanical readings, the old field map, and the tested response from the Western trial. There was no missing discovery left to make. No hidden setting would preserve the equipment and restore the route at the same time. She opened the hazard order. The remaining deviation is caused by the processing branch, she said. I confirmed the recommendation to isolate it. She signed. The operations supervisor reviewed the status board one last time. Essential systems confirmed independent. Western sector confirmed clear. Biological recommendation recorded. The supervisor authorized the cut. The chief grid engineer executed it. The processing district went dark. Conveyor lights vanished. The main separator stopped in the middle of its cycle. Warning panels lost primary power and returned only on local emergency cells. Deep inside the plant, heavy machinery wound down with uneven sounds that suggested some of it would never start again. Outside, the last human-made distortion collapsed. The misaligned indicators stopped moving toward the settlement. For several seconds, they held still. Then they turned west. The section of the body nearest the processing district rotated away from the foundations. Its locking face met the structure waiting along the restored corridor. The 2 surfaces joined, and a wave of movement passed through the complete form. The survey rings remained low and steady. The body did not follow them like a machine receiving a command. It simply no longer received a stronger false direction from the grid. One final support lifted from the earth. The network below the plane tightened. Mineral fibers pulled the remaining modules into place, then released as the body took its own weight. The ground settled behind it. In the control room, no one spoke as the organism stood fully above the surface. Celia had built a model from scattered excavation records, but it had not prepared her for the scale. The completed body reached across a distance that had once contained separate work sites. Its Its crystal bands held the color of early sunlight. Dust poured from its older surfaces and drifted low across the plain. It did not turn toward the settlement. It did not search for the people watching it. Its first movement was not a warning or a greeting. One support shifted forward and settled on the ancient magnetic corridor. Then another followed. The body began to walk toward the western basin. Each step was slow enough to reveal how the modules shared force. A ring compressed. A broad support accepted the load. Flexible crystal bands drew the next section forward. The entire structure moved as one system because for the first time, it was one system. Celia looked at the sealed sample box beside the display. She found a matching curve on the moving body. The new rib occupied the exact place of the old one. It flexed with the surrounding frame and carried its part of the weight. The rib in the box was still 3 million years old. The rib on the body was only days old. Neither had traveled backward through time. One had been the temporary framework. The other was the working part built from the minerals of the plain. The first question had its answer. The second did too. The fossils had grown younger because the old mineral frame had been removed and replaced until the dating machines had almost nothing ancient left to read. And now the final answer crossed the western horizon in front of her. At age 0, the thousands of skeletons had not become thousands of creatures. They had become one. The cost appeared on the control displays almost as quickly as the answer. The extraction network was offline. The processing batch was unrecoverable. Several drive systems failed their restart checks. Backup power supported the settlement's essential needs, but nothing more. The operations supervisor began issuing repair priorities. No one congratulated Celia. No one erased the review attached to her original report. The result had protected the settlement, but it did not make the first classification correct or restore the losses caused by the final decision. Celia did not ask for either kind of forgiveness. She watched the body continue along the old route until the last of its great supports entered the stone basin. Behind it, the underground fiber network stopped transmitting pulses. Excavation pits that had once held pale frames now contained only old dust and brittle scaffolding. The magnetic readings slowly returned to the pattern recorded in the ancient rock. In the days that followed, the mining field was redesignated as a biological cycle zone. Full extraction could not resume. The grid would have to be rebuilt around the old corridor instead of across it. Celia's report entered formal review along with the decisions that had followed from it. The sealed rib remained evidence. It was not displayed as a trophy. It was stored beside the records of the replacement process, a piece of old structure that had helped humans recognize what the plane had been doing all along. They had believed they were digging through the remains of a distant past. In truth, they had built a settlement inside a birthplace. Far across the empty basin, the mineral body moved beneath the rising sun. To the dating machines, it had just reached age 0. To its own long life, it had finally become complete enough to enter the present. Celia had gone to the plane to study what she believed had died millions of years earlier. Instead, she witnessed a life that had taken those millions of years to be born. Her decision protected the settlement and restored the organism's natural path, but it still carried a real cost. How would you have weighed that responsibility? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this mystery, please like the video, share it with another science fiction listener, and subscribe for more journeys into the unknown.